and I wanted to introduce the next speaker, Walter Block. A guy has to be really passionate about the subject to be taking time off while he has personal reasons to be away from this place, but I'm very grateful to Walter Block to be here today and talk to us. I mentioned halfway during the day that I would return money to anyone who did not find value in the day, but you have to understand the value means something which provides you something. If something offends you, that is still value. So, if the next speaker offends you, please do not come to me asking for money. You can just come to me and ask for the money and give it back to you. So as I said, you do expect to be offended whether you are a black or a white or a male or a female. He shocks the university students, he shocks everyone, and he tests the tolerance of people's free speech limits. So I think the best thing is I'll hand you over to Walter Block, who has been kind enough to take some time off today to speak with us, and I'm very honored to have him here today. Mr. Block.
Magnificent introduction. I think that someone was saying, well, why is he mentioning this right before you speak? They don't call me Walter Nice Guy Block for nothing. I can't understand this. I had a speech prepared, but I am inspired by Larry's discussion of heroism and the three people that mentioned heroes. So I want to talk a little bit about that before I get into what I had prepared. One of the local heroes is Bill Tomlinson, who recently passed away. He's a local British Columbia, Vancouver hero. I think he was responsible for Tunya's conversion. I'm not sure, is that correct, Tunya? That he was, Bill was a plumber, and he, goes around doing plumbing and somehow converted Tunya. So it's just magnificent. Another local person is Kurt Pokrant, who was involved in what Mary Lou mentioned, ISIL conference that he held in Whistler a couple of years back. He's still around. His wife is very sick, and he's getting old. So I think he couldn't be with us for that reason. But these are local heroes that we should acknowledge. Paul, could you stand up? Yeah. Paul is one of our local heroes. What Jayan said was absolutely correct. If it weren't for Paul, we wouldn't have much of a libertarian movement in Vancouver. So those of you who live in Vancouver and are not on Paul's list, you must, this is an order from a libertarian, you must get on his list so that you'll be apprised of libertarian goings on. Another hero, of course, is Jayan, who we owe for this conference. My own personal heroes are Rand, who converted me, Rand and Brandon together, Rothbard, Mises, Ron Paul. These are people who put us on the map. But I agree with the young man who spoke that we're all heroes. Every last one of us who is promoting liberty is heroic to that extent, because liberty is what keeps us from barbarism, I guess. And without individual people talking to their neighbors, to their schoolmates, to their workmates, whatever, we would be very much further behind in our promotion of liberty than we now are. Okay, let me talk a little bit about what I thought I would be talking about, and that is capitalism and morality. I recently got into a debate with Sheldon Richman and some others over whether we should use the word capitalism. And I noticed that our conference is termed capitalism and morality, and I was on the side of saying that capitalism is fine. Just because the word started out by a bunch of Marxists criticizing free enterprises doesn't mean that we can't use the word. Ayn Rand certainly didn't run away from that word, and she's probably responsible for converting more people to libertarianism than any other one person. Maybe Ron Paul is close, I'm not sure how to count that, but I'm a capitalist, laissez-faire capitalist, not a state monopoly corporate capitalist, which is fascism, which is a very different kind of a thing. But I think there's nothing wrong with capitalism. And I think it's very important that we defend capitalism not on the usual ground that it's more efficient, more economically efficient, but also on the ground that it is moral, more moral. For example, Reagan has a watch there, and I'm greatly desirous of getting that watch. I mean, I've been lusting after that watch these many moons, and there are two ways that I can get it out of her, or off of her. And one is the civilized way, and the other is the barbaric way. And the civilized way is the moral way, and the barbaric way is the immoral way, and the civilized moral way is the capitalist way. I can make her an offer which she's free to refuse. I can say, I'll be your best friend forever if you give me the watch. No, get back. You're ruining my example. I'm reminded, in terms of ruining examples, Murray Rothbard used to say, if I put on a piece of paper 10 Rothbards and I try to buy something with it, no one would sell me anything. He was trying to show that money necessarily emerges as a commodity, and I always used to raise my hand. I was a snotty kid. I said, I'll take it, Murray, I'll take it. Can you imagine how much that would be worth now if I had a thing that said 10 Rothbards signed by him? I mean, it would be a museum piece or something, but his theory was correct, even though it had that weird example of sentimental value. Okay, so one offer I can, $500, be your best friend forever, trade you my watch, my tie, whatever it is. These are all civilized ways, and if I don't get the watch out of Reagan, well, it's tough on me. I just have to go on with life without it. But then there's the barbaric way. I'm bigger than her. Forget about her husband sitting there, and I'm too old and fat to fight, but I could squash her if I sat on her, and I could grab the watch from her, and that's barbaric. That's nasty. I mean, that's cruel and vicious and depraved and immoral. And yet, that is the only other alternative that I have. Now, the first one is the market. Buying and selling, making voluntary trades, voluntary offers, and if they're accepted, good, and if not, not. But this is a barbaric way. This is uncivilized. And yet, that's the political way. Well, maybe not on a one-to-one basis, but, let's say I'm a great orator and I convince all of you that I should have a watch, and we all have a democratic vote, and you say, yeah, but Walter should have Reagan's watch, and now we seize it from her, and we say, well, and she protests, she says, well, that's immoral, you're invading me, you're using violence against me. And I said, but we had a vote. Well, it doesn't mean too much. So capitalism is just the concatenation of all trades, all voluntary trades, buying, selling, renting, borrowing, lending, working for people, employment. That's all the market is. That's all the market is voluntary trades. And if you favor morality, and you understand morality at least close to the way I understand it, well, that's sort of the essence of what morality is. So I conclude that the market is a moral thing. Capitalism is ethical. It's the only ethical system because we include there voluntary charity. Like if I'm really a great whiner and sniveler, and I said, I need your watch, and she gave it to me, well, that's part of the voluntary sector, right? Charity is part of the voluntary sector. So those two things, buying and selling and trading and charity, is part of the capitalist system, and everything else, coercion, grabbing stuff, prohibiting stuff against people's will, is the immoral sector. So markets are moral, capitalism is moral, capitalism is ethical. Libertarianism is the philosophy that promotes ethical treatment, that promotes capitalism, that promotes liberty. So what is liberty? Well, I think liberty is predicated on two different independent principles. The first principle is the non-aggression principle, NAP, non-aggression axiom, non-aggression principle, namely, keep your bloody mitts to yourself. Unless you have the permission of other people, So boxing is okay. You know, if Larry and I get into a boxing match in the ring and we agree, you know, and I punch him, he can't say, oh, assault and battery, you know, keep your mitts to yourself. You know, he can't do that because he's agreed to be hit, and I've agreed to be hit. Now, if I hit him below the belt, then that would be a foul. But boxing would be legitimate. So would be voluntary sadomasochism. Not that I'm suggesting that Larry and I are into that. We're into other things, but not that. So libertarianism is the promotion of liberty. Now, Larry mentioned shrewdness, ruthlessness, and a few other character defects. You know, I wrote this book, Defending the Undefendable, and I called all those people heroes. Well, a lot of them are shrewd and vicious and stuff like that. What I'm trying to say is that just because you're nasty doesn't mean you can't be a libertarian. You can be hateful. You can be a son of a whatever and be a libertarian. You just have to keep your mitts to yourself and not join gangs where the gang gets its mitts around somebody's neck and shakes them. So you can be vicious if you want to be. Another one is collectivism versus individualism. I don't think that libertarianism is particularly individualistic, because if libertarianism was individualistic, we would favor individualist sports and be against collectivist sports, such as team sports, right? In basketball, football, baseball, it's a team sport. You're supposed to help the team. The collective wins. You're always taught, well, don't brag about your scores. If your team lost, you know, that's bad. It's a very collectivist kind of a thing, but it's voluntary collectivism, so it's okay. I used to play in an orchestra. I played the violin. I'm what's called a hit violinist. You know, you hate your neighbor, you hire me to play near his house. He's toast. And every time I would, you know, play a wrong note, the conductor would hit his, you know, block shape up. You know what he would do to the wind players? He would tell them when to breathe. Anyone play a wind instrument in an orchestra? They tell you when to breathe. You breathe at the wrong time. The conductor stops and says, hey, you jerk, breathe when it says so in the music. Don't breathe when you think you want to breathe. And yet, even slavery, I don't think they ever told them when to breathe. You know, pick your cotton and here's your wool, and you know, but they didn't tell you when to breathe. But the key is, with an orchestra, it's voluntary. So if it's voluntary, that's legitimate. Certainly, homeschooling is part of the free enterprise system. And by the way, you know when they have these little kids, 13-year-olds, are always having spelling bees? And you know who invariably wins, or who's in the top 9 out of the 10 finalists? Homeschooled kids, usually. Not always, but there's a disproportionate number of them. But homeschooling is just do it yourself. I mean, there's nothing great about doing it yourself carpentry. If I hire a carpenter, I'm not any the less a libertarian because I hired a carpenter and I didn't do it myself. Similarly, if I send my kids to a private school, it's sort of like a plumber, you know, sending it out or getting involved in the market. So I certainly support homeschooling, but I wouldn't want people to think that homeschooling is particularly libertarian vis-a-vis other kinds of voluntary schooling. Anything voluntary is libertarian. Okay, now I'm advertised to talk a little bit about...
Well, what's the second principle?
Oh, yeah. I'm getting... You're just lucky I don't drool. You know, I'm getting Alzheimer's. Thanks, I appreciate all the help I can get. I'm, you know, getting old and feeble. You know, I run track and I do swimming, and my times are like triple what they were when I was a kid. It's really pathetic how you slow down physically, and I think mentally too, so thanks. The second principle is private property rights. Because suppose that Larry and I are getting into a fight, and I'm grabbing Larry's jacket, and I take his jacket and I run away with it. Have I committed a crime against him? Well, it depends upon who is the rightful owner of that jacket. If he stole it from me yesterday, now I'm just repossessing it, right? So you can't deduce from the fact that I grabbed the jacket sitting on the table next to him that he wore before, that I'm the aggressor, I'm the criminal, and he's the innocent victim. It all depends upon who is the rightful property owner. So, for libertarians, how do we get rightful property? How do we justify any particular property title? Well, the view of John Locke and Murray Rothbard and Hans Hoppe, who's done the greatest work on this field of homesteading, as far as I'm concerned, is homesteading for virgin territory. So I go out into the woods and no one has ever owned this land, we just moved here, and I clear the land and I start planting corn. And you, my next door neighbor, go domesticate a cow, a wild cow, you tame it and you get milk from it. Well, I own the corn and you own the milk, because I homesteaded the land that grew the corn, you homesteaded the cow that gave the milk. So the first key is homesteading. The second one would be any voluntary interaction, like buying and selling and trading and giving gifts and whatever. So if Larry and I decide to trade some milk for some corn, I now own the milk, even though I have no role in producing it. He now owns the corn, even though he didn't do anything with corn, but we can each trace it back to a voluntary trade and then to homesteading. So the opposite side of the coin of the non-aggression axiom is property rights. Because without property rights, you have no idea of who's aggressing against whom. We could, let me just briefly mention reparations. Suppose that Larry's great-grandfather stole that coat from my great-great-grandfather. Am I now entitled to come and get it from him? I think yes, because there's no statute of limitations on justice. Now, the burden of proof is on me. The burden, possession is 9/10 of the law. So if he's got the jacket and you all saw him with the jacket and I come and grab it, it's up to me to prove somehow that that he stole it from me yesterday or that his grandfather stole it from my grandfather. Which gets us into reparations for slavery, which occurred 150 years ago. And there are some conservatives like David Horowitz, who would say, well, it's illegitimate. And what they mean by reparations is stuff like this guy Robinson is saying, I forget his first name, some black guy who says, we ought to give the country to blacks, or other people say we ought to give the whole country to Indians. Well, the burden of proof is on he who wants to change extant property titles, but the libertarian, I think, is open to this, at least in principle. Namely, if I can prove that, I have a picture of that jacket with my grandfather on it, well, I should go to a private court and be able to get that jacket out of Larry. So, thanks again. The opposite, the second principle is property rights. Okay, now, what I've been advertised to do is to talk about Keynesianism and our economic debacle, and a little bit about profit-seeking, legalizing drugs, and privatizing public property. So I'll do that in the next little while, and then we'll have some questions and dialogue and debate and what have you. So what's going on with Keynesianism? What is Keynesianism? Keynesianism is the view that the economy is sort of like a car. And if it's going too slow, you hit the gas. And if it's going too fast, you hit the brakes. And the economy, if left to its own devices, has no ability within itself to regulate itself. There are no market forces that regulate the economy to make it run smoothly. It's always veering off into positive animal spirits, where we have progress, and we have a good part of the business cycle, and then people get depressed. It's sort of like a psychiatric view of the economy. If everyone gets depressed, and we have no economic psychiatrist, we have the government. They'll hit the gas. And if everyone is too exuberant, they're climbing up the walls or something with exuberance, well, then we have to put the brake on. That's what Keynesianism is. Now, there's a lot of misconceptions about what's going on here. The way I see things, there are two versions of Keynesianism. One is the fiscalist Keynesianism, which is promulgated by Keynes himself, and by Krugman, and by Samuelson, and by the lefties.
And Stephen Harper.
I'm sorry?
And Stephen Harper.
Well, okay, yeah. let me give me enough rope to hang myself there. I'm not sure about it. It's an interesting question, though. For them, the gas pedal and the brakes consist of fiscal policy. If we need more exuberance, if we're depressed, well, then we have to have a stimulus program, and the stimulus program consists of spending more. Government should spend more. And if we are too exuberant, then the fiscal policy is to run a budget surplus. A budget deficit in the first place, a budget surplus in the second place. But then there were these other Keynesians who are somehow construed as free enterprises, and they're the monetarist Keynesians, and these are people like Friedman and the University of Chicago and such like. And they're just as much Keynesians as the left-wing fiscalist Keynesians. They're the right-wing monetarist Keynesians, and the way I see libertarianism, it's sort of like a three-legged stool. We are equidistant from the liberals over here, or the left liberals and the right conservatives. We're no more on the one side than we are on the other. A lot of times they'll give us these political quizzes to see if you're a lefty or a righty, and I always come out as a moderate. Because, for personal liberties, I'm a leftist, and for economic liberties, I'm a rightist. So it's sort of, I get a moderate number, which is, ridiculous. Libertarianism is equidistant from these two. Libertarianism is, or Austrian economics in this case, is equidistant from both branches of Keynesianism. It's just as much central planning to have a fiscal brake and gas as to have a monetary brake and gas. And what's the monetary brake and gas? Well, when the economy is in the doldrums, you pump in the money supply, and when it's too exuberant, you pull money out. That's just as much central planning of a different variety. And the big debate in the economic literature is which of these interventionists is correct. And somehow, the monetarist ones get to be called the free enterprise ones. I was at this meeting called API, Association of Political Professional Free Enterprise, something. Anyone know what API stands for? APEE? Who knows? And what they had was the people from the Dallas Fed or the Free Enterprise Fed. I mean that's like going in the Soviet Union and saying, well, the people in charge of agriculture are left-wingers, but the people in charge of factories, they're the free enterprises. I mean, I had a full head of hair before I heard that. It was just crazy. Now, Milton Friedman objects to this. Paul Samuelson had a textbook, which is a very, very big seller. I'm sure most of the economists in the room grew up on that. And each chapter has a little quote from some famous person. And one of the chapters that Samuelson wrote, he introduced with a quote from Milton Friedman, and the quote was, "We're all Keynesians now." So I asked Milton about this. I said, no, Samuelson's all wrong, he's got it all wrong. And here's the quote, and I'll give it to you, I'll paraphrase what he told me. What Milton Friedman, here's the full quote. "When it comes to public policy analysis, there are gigantic differences between us monetarists and them thar Keynesians, or them thar fiscalists. But when it comes to the tools of analysis, we're all Keynesians now." Well, to me, he's giving away the store. Because surely the public policy analysis emanates from the tools of analysis, not the other way around. So if he believes in Keynesian tools of analysis, and he comes up with different conclusions than the other guys, well, then there's some glitch in the logic. It's not that he's not a Keynesian, he is a Keynesian. And I'm again Keynesianism. Okay, so what's the Austrian alternative? See, for the Keynesians, it's sort of an all or none thing. If the economy is doing badly, you've got to pump it up. Pump it up fiscally, pump it up monetarily, it doesn't really matter much. But for the Austrians, it's very different. We don't believe that it's a matter of pumping it up or pumping it down. Rather, we have a misallocation theory of the business cycle. What's the misallocation of the business cycle? It's not that there's too much or too little, it's that there isn't the right stuff. It's the wrong stuff. Now I have to talk about the interest rate. Now the interest rate is boring, but one of the benefits of this, if you really learn it, is you'll have great soporific powers. You can put anyone to sleep with interest rates, so if you're ever called upon to, put someone to sleep, you can say, aha, interest rates, and give you this lecture that I'm now about to give you on interest rates. What's going on with interest rates? What's going on with interest rates is when the Fed creates the money supply, extra money supply, or when you get into fiscalist machinations, they mess around with the interest rate. And the interest rate is a crucial economic variable, more crucial than the price of pretty much any one other thing, like the price of carrots or the price of cars or the price of wristwatches or any other one price, because the interest rate permeates the entire economy, just like money permeates the entire economy. Suppose you want to go in the business of producing redwood trees. Now, how long does it take to get a redwood tree to go from a little, not an acorn, but a redwood seed to a full, big fat redwood tree? 100 years, something like that? Now, you sorry?
2,000 years.
Oh, 2,000 years? I thought 100 years. Well, it shows how much I know. It takes a lot of time. So I ask you, is this likely to occur more when there's a high interest rate or a low interest rate? And the right answer is it's more likely to occur when it's a low interest rate, because you always have an option of putting money in the bank or getting money in the loan market or what have you, the bond market. And you're not going to wait 100 years if the interest rate is high and you can get 10% in the market, whereas the rate of growth of that tree is very, very small, because it takes, if it's 2,000 years, it's 1/10 of 1% of interest per year or something like that, right? If it's 100 years, you're just getting 1%. Okay, so if the interest rate is very low, this allows for long-term investments, right? Mining. I mean, Morgan isn't here, but he can tell you that it takes a long time to get metals out of the earth. You have to look for it. It takes 2 or 3 years. You have a lot of empty holes before you hit it right. It takes a long time to build the mine, and then it takes an even longer time for the metal or gold or whatever it is you're digging out of the earth to come on stream, and then it lasts a long time. So when you talk about heavy industry, coffee trees are another one. It takes a long time for a coffee tree to be able to produce coffee. These are very low interest rate kinds of things. So when the government artificially lowers the interest rate, what it does is it pushes investment into long-term efforts. But the interest rate is determined by the time preferences of the public, their saving and investment decisions, or how much they want to save and how much they want to consume. And let's suppose that the marginal saver, I told you it'd be boring, but you'll be ready to put people to sleep. Let's suppose that the decision of the market is to have a 10% interest rate. Well, that means that you have to sort of cut off very heavy stuff. Not that you can't have any heavy, long-range things, but you have to have less of it and more short-time investments. But if the government lowers the rate of interest from 10% to 1%, it encourages entrepreneurs to malinvest. It's a malinvestment theory, the Austrian theory. Well, then what we have is investment in the wrong places. We have investment in the wrong places, and this can't go on forever. Hayek wrote this book, A Tiger by the Tail. If you have a tiger by the tail, it's a rough kind of a thing, rough kind of a place to be in. Sooner or later, you're not going to come to a good end. Well, if you inflate and you keep having to increase the rate of inflation to keep the economy going because you're stepping on the gas, eventually you can't do it because your bonds aren't going to be bought by anyone. China's going to not buy your bonds anymore, or you're going to get into hyperinflation. So eventually they have to stop. And when they have to stop, those investments that were part of the boom are now revealed to be malinvestments and have to be lowered in price. Hint, hint, housing. I mean, housing is a long-term investment. It takes a long time to get all the bricks and the wires, and the house lasts for a long time, 100 years. Not public housing, that'll go bond the boards in a couple of months. But, private individual housing, it's a very long-lived kind of an investment. So one of the reasons for our present economic debacle is that entrepreneurs have been encouraged to invest in places that they never should have invested in the first place because the market signals have been perverted by the government. The second reason for this, the second reason for our debacle, is the Boston Fed. The Boston Fed in 1992 came up with a study that said that the banks in the Boston area are racist. Why are the banks in the Boston area racist? The banks in the Boston area are racist because black people are not getting a equally proportionate share of the mortgages. I don't know what the proportion of black people is in Boston, but in the US it's around 13, 14%. Let's suppose that that was true in Boston. Well, then blacks were getting less than 14%. Let's say we're getting 5% of the mortgages. And the Boston Fed said that, well, this is racist. The problem with that is that the default rates on mortgages for whites and blacks were identical. And if it really was racist, namely they were not giving equally qualified black people mortgages, well, then you'd have a higher a default rate on the part of whites because you would only be giving the top blacks the mortgages, the ones that were really good risks. But it was equal, so that shows there was no racism. But Teddy Kennedy, I guess, who knows, HUD, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, they started in with the banks. Now in the old traditional way, you want to come in for a loan for a bank, they're going to start asking you very intrusive questions. Not non-libertarian questions, but intrusive. They're going to say, do you have a job? Do you have a fixed address? Do you have a credit rating? Do you have 10 or 20% to put down against the house? But black people had less of this, less collateral, less financial credibility than white people. So to ask this was now deemed to be racist. So you couldn't ask that anymore. And if you did ask that, you can get in trouble. And then they would have, banking is a very heavily regulated industry. And if you started asking questions like this, there'd be problems for you. Did anyone ever see that Eddie Murphy skit where Eddie turns to be a white person? It's just, he's really magnificent. He puts on white face and he acts like a white person. He sort of clenches his buttocks as he walks because white people can't walk. Rather, white people walk not smoothly with black. It was really funny. So anyway, what happens is he gets on this bus and there are black and white people. And as soon as the black people get off, Eddie looks white, they break out the band and they have hors d'oeuvres and, to show, just what the whites are doing. And then there's this thing where you go to the bank. And now Eddie goes to the bank and he hits a black loan officer and he says, I want a loan. And the guy starts giving him this stuff. He'll go, well, do you have any address? Do you have any job? Do you have collateral? And Eddie sort of looks puzzled. And then the white guy, the white boss of this black boss banker, says, Mr. Jones, I'll take care of Eddie Murphy. And he brings him into his room. And he says, you want money? Here, take it. And he starts giving him money. And that's roughly what was going on. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but they were giving people houses that in the old, more stringent requirements would never have qualified for these mortgages. And then they were using these mortgage papers to pyramid on top of, which came out to be toxic loans. And then you had to protect the banks because we have fractional reserve banking, and the banks are inherently in trouble. Let me just talk about fractional reserve banking. You really put people to sleep with fractional reserve banking. But here is the deal. Let's suppose that Larry comes to me, I'm the banker, and he deposits $100 in my bank. And I have a 10% reserve ratio, so I keep 10 of it, and I lend 90 out to Mary Lou. I lend it out, when Larry deposits the $100 in the bank, what I do is I give him a checking account, a demand deposit for $100. And I say, you can come in any time and draw out as much as you want. Then I give Mary Lou a loan for 90, and I give it to her in the form also of a checking deposit. And I say, Mary Lou, you have $90, you can access it whenever you want. Well now, thanks to the magic of fractional reserve banking, instead of the 100 that Larry had, which was say gold backed or whatever, we now have 190. And then the next banker, when Mary Lou withdraws it from me and she deposits in somebody else's bank, that guy will keep 83 or whatever the fraction is, I guess 81. And if you have a fractional reserve of 10%, $100 comes out into 1,000. So the problem is, suppose you have a bank run. Suppose Mary Lou and Larry come to me at the same time and say, hey, Larry says, I'd like my 100, and Mary Lou said, I'd like my 90, and all I've got is 10. I'm in trouble. There was this great movie, It's a Good Life? It's a Wonderful Life, where they had a bank run, a very, very excellent movie, not the economic part of it, but the bank run part, and people were demanding their money, and the guy didn't have it. So the banks are, you know in the Olympics when they have these bike races, a lot of times the bike races you're supposed to go fast, but sometimes the technique is to stand still on the bike without putting your feet on the ground. And they start tottering around, and then they have to ride. That's what the banking system is like. It's sort of on two wheels, stopped, and they're teetering around. So the banks are always in trouble. There's always a threat of bank runs. Thank God now we have the FDIC, which says we'll bail out the banks. Maybe we'll create a lot of money if there's ever a bank run, which will lead us into a hyperinflation. So we have two sources of the present debacle. One, the Fed screwed around with the interest rates. Secondly, they messed around with the housing. And the third one, I guess, is the unions in Detroit. You know what those guys make on the assembly line? I think something like 75 or 80 bucks. Whereas in the South, when they have Toyota in Georgia or somewhere, it's 30 or 40 bucks. They're making 70, 80 bucks an hour. And very generous fringe benefits. Well, now we have government motors. General Motors is government motors. So we have the interest rate, we have housing, we have cars, all sort of combining into one big horrible witch's brew. And that's why we have the problem. And what they're doing is bailing out here and bailing out there, which is weakening the dollar. I mean, the gold is now up to 1,200, 1,210, something like that, which indicates the weakness of the dollar. So that is sort of my 15, 20 minutes on that. And now, in order to not have Giant accused of fraud, I'll get to some of these other subjects that I've said I would talk about. Legalizing drugs and privatizing public property. Legalizing drugs leads me to mention another hero, our Prince of Pot, Mark Emery. He's not really a libertarian. He's more of a potitarian. I mean, his view is not that it should be legalized, whether it's harmful or harmless. Rather, his view is that it's great. It's wonderful. Therefore, it should be legalized. But suppose we find out that it causes cancer or whatever. Libertarians still want to legalize it, whereas he, if he sticks to his principles of pot is good, would have to say, well, you know, I no longer want to legalize pot.
I don't think that's his position.
Well, I'm saying if he were logically consistent and stuck to his view that pot is good and that's why we should legalize it, then logic would compel him to that conclusion. Now, he might not draw that conclusion, but that would just show he's not following the logic of his position. I'm an agnostic on whether pot is good or bad. I'm just a lowly economist. I don't know. I'm no chemist. I'm no physician. I don't know if it's good or bad. All I know as a libertarian is that whether it's good or not, people should be able to be free to put in whatever crap into their bodies that they want. And other people ought to be free to sell it to them. Capitalist acts between consenting adults. There's another argument put forth by Steve Easton, another quasi-libertarian associated with my ex-employer, the Fraser Institute. I'm on drugs here. What Steve says is, well, we ought to legalize it because then the government could tax it, and the government would have more money. And I would say we ought to legalize it in spite of the fact that the government would have more money. I mean, the government already got too much money. The last thing we want is for them to have more money, but still we want to do justice, and we shouldn't put people in jail for buying and selling and using possibly dangerous substances. Not children. Children are always an exception for the libertarian and for everyone else. So I certainly, as a libertarian, favor the legalization of marijuana, heroin, cocaine, whatever drug you name. I think we should legalize it. And some people say, well, it's associated with crime. Look at Mexico. But the very opposite is the case. The reason Mexico is in such trouble, the reason the Arizona people are so upset is because there's a lot of crime. And by the way, the Phoenix Suns basketball team that now has a thing, Los Suns. Los is the in Spanish. Instead of the Suns, was to show their camaraderie with the Hispanic people. Some 70% of the people in Arizona favor that law because they're afraid of Mexican criminals. But there's no intrinsic connection between drugs and crime. Rather, the intrinsic connection is not between drugs and crime, but between prohibition and crime. The reason that they that it's associated with crime is because when it's illegal, the supply curve shifts to the left. There's less supply to the market because people are scared to do it, and now you need a different kind of an entrepreneur. Look, if we prohibited red ties, and people wanted red tie. Right now, the red tie people, no one is calling them greedy, and no one, I mean, I haven't seen anything in the newspaper about evil red tie sellers. But if we prohibited red tie sales, and people wanted them, well, then the price would really skyrocket, because now not only do you have to buy land, labor, and capital to produce this stuff and marketing costs, but now you have costs of eluding the police, which is very expensive. And then if you wanted one, you'd have to go steal to get it. You'd have to do carjacking and TV lifting because the ties would be so expensive. And then there'd be fights between tie distributors, very much like alcohol during Prohibition. I mean, it's the same economics. The economics is invariable. And yet somehow they just don't get it. I live in New Orleans for half of the year. I teach down at Loyola University. And I was once on this black TV show, and I was telling the left-wing black host, look, forget about affirmative action, forget about this. Young black men every day in the newspaper are being killed. Isn't this a problem? Isn't this the major problem? What are you talking about? Welfare should be raised by $5 or something. Young black men are being killed. Why are they being killed? Because of the illegal drugs. Let's get behind legalizing drugs. And, oh no, he's not having this. And I said, but it's the same thing with alcohol, only it was young Italian men that were shooting each other. And he says, well, we should go to prohibition of alcohol. I mean, if I hadn't used that joke about having no hair before, I could use it again now. But, it's very hard to deal with these people sometimes. And I don't mean just black people. I mean all non-libertarian, all non-free enterprise economists. Okay, let me talk a little. I go from 2:30 to 4:30. Is that right?
Yeah, whatever time it takes for you.
No, I want to stick to the schedule. And when am I supposed to end?
Well, it's 3:15, so you can carry on for another hour if you want to, but I'm good. If you want to talk
captive audience
yeah.
for a whole hour. Well, I'll stop before that because I think we'll have questions and discussion. Let me do two more things. One is the privatized public property, and the other is the profit-seeking business. My most recent book is, I forget the title, it's something privatizing roads. Road privatization? It's a long-winded title. I didn't pick it. My title was Privatize Roads Now, MF. I have to fill in but they didn't like that title. So we got this long-winded title about privatizing roads. Do you people know how many people die in the U.S. of road fatalities every year? 40,000. And in Canada, roughly 10%, 4,000 people. I don't know how many Canadians died in the Afghan war, a couple of hundred? 150. And already people are getting antsy. They're seeing dead bodies come back. That's only 150 in a couple of years. 4,000 Canadians die every year. And in the US, it's 40,000. And is it in the newspapers? No. Is anyone holding hearings about this? Well, Ron Paul might. I'll try to get him to do it. He'd be the only one. who might, or maybe Rand Paul if he wins, or the guy in Connecticut. Sorry?
Peter Schiff.
Yeah, he might. We might get some libertarians in the U.S. Congress. 40,000 people a year die. Why isn't this a disgrace? Why isn't this talked about? Why isn't this seen as a failure? You know that if the roads were private and 40,000 people a year were dying on them, we'd be having hearings by the left-wing types saying it's greed and capitalism and this and that and the other. But since it's the government, it's sort of like the inevitability of death and taxes. Nobody talks about it. Yeah, death, taxes, and road fatalities. You know, it's sort of like acts of God, or God did it, and you don't want to blame God. What they do is they blame it on all sorts of other things, like speeding, and vehicle malfunction, and driver error, and drunken driving. MAD, Mothers Against Drunken Driving, are very upset about that.
Accelerators.
Right, accelerators from Toyota or whatever. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has 125 different reasons for it. And those are the top 3 or 4, but then there are very, very minute things like distance from a highway to the hospital, response of the ambulance. I mean, all these are not irrelevant, but they have like 125 different accounts, all of which is to confuse proximate cause with ultimate cause. Let me give you some examples of the difference between ultimate and proximate cause. Suppose I take a rifle and I shoot right out there and I hit that guy. And then a bunch of you grab me because I'm a murderer. And I say, tut tut, not so fast. It wasn't me, it was the bullet. It's just silly. Of course the bullet, I didn't do it. It was a rifle. These guys are 200 yards away. But I'm the ultimate cause. Yes, the proximate cause is the bullet, but that's silly. Well, my claim is that this speeding and drunken driving and this and that and the other is just the proximate cause. The ultimate cause is, well, let me try again. We're now in this restaurant. Well, it's not really a restaurant, but let's suppose it was a restaurant. And suppose that the restaurant was failing. And we're now management consultants brought in to figure out why is that the restaurant is failing. And we come up with things like, well, the food is lousy. The waitress service is no good. The place is filthy. And it's located on a cul-de-sac. Location, location, location. What would you think of those explanations? You'd say that's silly. It's the management. The management is the one who picked the location. The management is the one who picked the cook. The management is the one who didn't give somebody a broom. The management is the one who didn't hire good waitresses, right? It's the management. That's the ultimate cause. The proximate cause is just, you know, the wrong color, tablecloth, or whatever it is. Well, so is it in this case. In the case of roads, who is the management? The management is the goddamn government. The manager is a monopoly government. Look, if they served a bad meal and we didn't come back here, the people who ran the restaurant would lose money, and if they lost enough money, they'd automatically go broke, and someone else would buy up the premises. That's why restaurants aren't so bad. That's why wristwatches aren't so bad, pizza's not so bad, the ties aren't so bad, because we rely on the market. And the market has this, according to Henry Hazlitt in his Economics in One Lesson, has this process, weeding out process of inefficiency. Well, who loses money if somebody gets into a car crash right outside here on Pender, I guess it is? Does the mayor of the city lose money? I mean, the people who get in the car crash do. They suffer. But the people in charge of the rules of the road, the people in charge of making the road, do they lose money? No. All we have is the Sovietization of streets and highways and avenues and boulevards and roadways. And why should we expect Sovietization to work well here when it didn't work well in Russia? People in Russia are smart. They had a Sputnik. Out of the top 500 grandmasters in chess, most of them are Russians. Many don't live there anymore, but most of them they're very bright people. The failure of the Soviet experiment wasn't that they were stupid, it was that they were engaged in communism. Well, we're engaged in communism on roads. Now in this book I speculate as to, well, what kind of rules could we have that would reduce deaths? And One of them is, well, every time there's a death, you have a cross to indicate where the death occurred. And even now, they're starting to do it, but they have crosses about this big. I was thinking, big, where no one can see it. Take highways. Right now, the minimum speed of a highway is 40 miles an hour. In the US, the maximum is 70. I used to have this Honda 90cc motorcycle, which if I was going downhill with a tailwind, I could do 45. If I was going uphill with a passenger with a headwind, 30. But I'd get on the highway, I'd sort of. And when you're driving 70 miles an hour, you're the slowest one on the road, people keep going by like that. So the variation in speed is maybe 35 miles an hour to 80. Maybe, I don't know, I'm not a road manager, but maybe it's not the speed, but it's the variation in speed. Maybe it's the fact that you get someone in the left lane who's doing exactly 70, and people have to go around them. Maybe they should have the right-hand lane 50, the middle lane 65, and the left one 80. I don't know. All I know is that if we had private ownership and different road owners had different policies, and some succeeded and some didn't, then we'd be more like in ties and pizza, where people learned from each other and where people had mistakes. The rest of the book goes through all sorts of objections. Well, you just can't have it because you need eminent domain, or what do they call it in Canada? Expropriation. And I go through how in the marketplace we could do it without expropriation or without eminent domain. And I got into this big fight with Epstein, Richard Epstein, who was another quasi-semi-demi libertarian, University of Chicago type. I think now he's at NYU. So that's enough for public property, legalizing drugs. Let me just do one last one on this profit maximizing thing, and that's minimum wage law. An old standard. What's happening with the minimum wage law? The minimum wage law is beloved of our friends on the left. They just love this thing because the way they see it, they're for the downtrodden, they want to help the poor. And the minimum wage is a floor on the wages which raises wages, and the higher the minimum is, the higher the lowest wage can be. And there's always in Canada debate as to how many, what should the minimum wage be. And now I think it's $8 or $9, $10, somewhere like that. In the US it's a little lower. This is the wrong way to look at it. If you have to look at it in terms of physical things, it's not a floor on the wages which rises and keeps wages higher. Rather, it's a high jump bar over which you have to jump to get a job, and the higher the bar is, the harder it is to jump into employment. Suppose someone has a productivity level of $20. That means that if you've got them on your shop floor, you capitalist pig, your receipts will be $20 an hour higher than if you didn't have them on your shop floor. What's the opening bid that you people would bid for the work of this guy?
$20.
No, you're not a capitalist pig. You're a disgrace. A capitalist pig has to exploit workers. What's the matter with you?
$20.01.
1 cent.
1 cent. There's the man. 1 penny. The workers will get uppity if you pay them too much. They won't respect you. 1 penny. Well, if Daniel offers this worker who's worth $20 an hour 1 penny, that means he'll be exploiting him, profiteering off of him to the extent of $19.99, right? So this young lady in the yellow top, you're a capitalist pig. You sort of rejoice in the fact that Daniel is exploiting a worker, but you want to pig out too on profits. So what are you going to offer? No hinting. But he's right. You'd offer 2 cents because you applaud exploiting of workers. This goes without saying. But you'd rather do the exploiting, and the only way you can do the exploiting is by offering a little bit more money. And the next guy will offer 3 cents and 4 cents, and where will it end? It'll end $20 in equilibrium, which we never get to, but we're always moving in that direction. And now I'm assuming that the cost of getting workers together is 0, which it isn't. So it might end up at 1950 or 1975 or something like that, close to 20. Namely, we have a theory. It's called the marginal revenue, actually the discounted marginal revenue product theory of wages, or productivity for short. Namely, wages tend to be in accordance with productivity. The reason LeBron James makes a lot of money, and Oprah Winfrey makes a lot of money, and Bill Gates makes a lot of money is they're very productive. They fill seats, or they produce computers, or whatever it is. The reason that the guy who sweeps the floor makes less is because he's less productive. The reason all of us make a middle class type salary is because our productivity is in the middle somewhere. Wages tend to marshal or match or be congruent with productivity. Okay, so now we got this worker making $20 an hour, and we pass a minimum wage that says you have to pay him $100 an hour. Well, if you have to pay him $100 an hour, you're going to lose $80 an hour from hiring him, right? Namely, you're putting the bar up here at 100. He can only jump 20. He can't jump into employment. Well, these are unrealistic numbers, but I introduced the subject in that way. Now let's get down to reality. Let's suppose that some young kid, usually a black kid in the US, his productivity is $5 an hour and the minimum wage law is $7 an hour. Anyone who hires him will now have to lose $2 an hour because they'll pay $7 for something worth $5. They might do it out of benevolence, out of charity. We talked to Loyola, had a friend who was charitable. Maybe she would do it, but she can't do too many of these, otherwise she'll go broke. Adam Smith said it's not from benevolence that the butcher and the baker and the candlestick maker give us their product. It's out of a keen appreciation of their self-interest. And if it's important to do something, it's important that we mobilize all human emotions, not just benevolence, but also selfishness, greed, whatever. So if we want to cure this problem, we have to get rid of the minimum wage, because even a minimum wage of 10 cents will unemploy people whose productivity is less than 10 cents. And there are such people. They're the mentally handicapped. If the minimum wage law was so great, why would they have an exception for teenagers? Well, they had to have the exception because teenagers, you know what the teenage unemployment rate is? It's double or triple the adult unemployment rate. By the way, something I forgot to say during the Keynesian thing, do you know why a lot more men are now getting pink slips than women? Is it because of sexism that suddenly we're turning against men? No, it's because men are disproportionately represented in the heavy industries. And why is it that teenagers are more unemployed than anyone else? Because we have the minimum wage. Who loves the minimum wage? Who favors the minimum wage? Who eats, sleeps, and breathes minimum wage? Unions, one of our least favorite institutions. Now, unions are not per se anti-libertarian. It's possible, it's conceivable. It's not a logical contradiction to have a union that is legitimate. If what they do is they limit themselves to one technique, namely, boss, you don't give us what we want, we're all walking out together. Now, in the early days of unionism, they would throw them in jail for that because it's anti-restraint of trade or some nonsense. They would use antitrust on unions. That would be unjust, because if one person has a right to quit, and if you don't have the right to quit, you're a slave. The only problem with slavery really was that you couldn't quit. Otherwise, it was a good deal. You could pick cotton, they'd give you mush to eat, they'd give you a little cabin. The problem is when they came out with the whip, you couldn't say, oh, I quit. That's the only problem with slavery. Well, if you can't quit your job, you're a slave. And if you can't quit your job just because other people are quitting at the same time, well, then you're a slave. So you have the right to quit. And if all the union insisted upon was mass quits, because look, if one guy leaves, the boss goes, I don't care. But if all 500 people walk out, it's got to hire another 500 people. It's a pain in the neck. So you give them 50 cents an hour more or whatever. If they're not above their productivity level already. And if they are, you say, well, walk. So if a union did that, it would be legitimate. But the union does something else. What it does, in addition to fomenting the minimum wage, and I'll explain why in a second, what the additional thing that the union does is says, not only are we going to quit, but we're going to circle your house, your factory, and make sure that scabs can't come in and take the jobs that we don't want to have. This is sort of like a husband divorces his wife, and then he and his friends surround her house, and anyone that tries to date her, they beat him up. Well, it's okay to divorce your wife, but you can't beat up anyone else that she wants to date and call them a scab or whatever, and then get laws passed saying that you can do this and that she has to bargain with you when she wants to divorce you? That's exactly what the union is doing. Why are they so intent on having a minimum wage law? The reason they love the minimum wage law is, look, suppose the union comes into management and says, look, we got to have a raise from $22 to $25 an hour. The first thing on the employer's mind is, well, how can I substitute out of the suddenly more expensive factor of production? If he were making rowboats out of plastic, metal, and wood, and the price of wood doubled, what would he start thinking of doing? Making rowboats out of plastic and metal, and maybe not so much out of wood, right? Because whenever the price of anything rises, you tend to want to buy less and more substitutes. So what the employer would like to do is fire a few of these skilled union workers and hire a few unskilled. And in the old blue-collar days, the only thing that the union could do with these young pups is beat them up, call them scabs and beat them up. But now they're more sophisticated. They get this wondrous thing called minimum wage law, which unemploys them, which puts the barrier, the high jump bar over which they have to jump to get a job above their productivity level. And now the employer doesn't have that option. So that's why the union favors it. And yet our friends on the left, they love unions, they love minimum wage laws. It's hard to deal with them sometimes. But the people on the right are equally crazy. I mean, they think that the United States, which has, 800 foreign military bases in 150 different countries, it's for defense. And when Ron Paul says, well, how would you like it if the Swiss had soldiers here and military bases all over? Would you call Swiss imperialists or would you call them defense? Oh no, it's different. Don't ask me why. Okay, well, I think I've done my job of covering the subject, and I now call upon something. Jayant, I call upon Jayant.
I think we can do the question answers while we, if people want to have coffee at the same time, there is still coffee and juices, so we can do both the things at the same time.
Well, why don't we take a 2-minute break because we've been sitting for an hour.
That's probably right. Yeah.
So let's take a 2 or 3 minute break and then we'll come back and ready to kick butt. I'm not sure whose butt, but I'm hoping that we'll have a discussion, dialogue, questions, criticisms, whatever. So if you have any questions or discussion or objections, there couldn't be any objections to my modest proposals. But if anyone has anything that they would like to contribute, there's a microphone right there, so you'll be immortalized.
Well, you mentioned the non-aggression principle as being one of the central tenets of the libertarian faith, so to speak. And I wonder if you could just extend that into, you like to take things to the nth degree to present an argument, so that if somebody comes into my house and steals something, I have a right to get it back. How much force can I use to get it back? How far can I run down the street? How violently can I tackle him? Can I go into his house? If he took it into his house and break the door down, he doesn't let me in to recoup it. And how much aggression can I use of the retaliatory type? And I'll just stick with that question.
Well, this is a question about libertarian punishment theory and also self-help. Usually, people don't do it themselves. Like you hire a plumber, you hire a cop, or the cop would protect you in the free society. The street would be owned by somebody, and that person would have an incentive to have a police force to make sure that this, exactly what you said, didn't happen. I would say that if he's in the act of grabbing your TV, you certainly could grab it back from him. And if he gets snarky, you could belt him one. You'd be certainly justified in doing that. Another question is, suppose I accidentally trespass on your lawn not knowing. Can you take a bazooka and blow me away? Well, I'm a moderate. I don't think you can. I think what you should do is say, hey, do you realize you're trespassing? This is private property. If I say, oh, sorry, I didn't realize, and I scoot off, well, then maybe a little fine or something, but it would be more of a slap on the wrist. And if you didn't have a sign there, it would be unclear as to really whether I'm a criminal trespasser or not. My theory on punishment theory is 2 teeth for a tooth plus cost of capture plus scaring. So how does this work? And I got this from Murray Rothbard, from whom I get an awful lot of weird stuff. Okay, so suppose I steal your TV. Well, the first thing that has to happen is I have to give you your TV back. That's the first tooth. The second tooth is what I try to do to you has to be done to me. Namely, you have to get my TV. Now, I claim that this is libertarian principle, it's not pragmatism, but from a pragmatic point of view, if the only punishment for me, the criminal, was that I had to give you back your own TV when I'm caught, what would be the incentive for me not to go try to get someone else's TV? Because if I steal 100 TVs, surely I'll be able to keep some of them. But if I have to give back a TV of my own when I'm caught, that'll slow me down a little bit. But I think we have to do a little bit more. Now, suppose I have your TV and I run right into the police station and say, hey, sorry, I took his TV, it was a moment of weakness, I'm giving it back to you, you give it back to him, or I go to you and I say, here it is. Well, then there are no costs of capturing me. But if I hide the TV in my own house, I'm now making the crime worse. Because not only have I stole your TV, but I'm also hiding this fact from the forces of law and order, which is a different crime, a separate crime. And now if there are 100 people out there looking for me, and it takes them a week, well, not only do I have to give you 2 TVs back, but I have to give the police force a lot of money for looking for me, which ought to slow me down a little bit even more. But then there's the scaring thing. When I came to you, you didn't know what I was going to do. You were scared. And now I have to be scared in return as part of my punishment, because we have to do unto the criminal what the criminal tried to do to the victim. And so how are you going to scare me? You going to go boo or something like that? No, I think Russian roulette is the way to scare me. That'll get my attention. And the number of bullets and the number of chambers should be in proportion to how scared I made you. Now, if I just pickpocketed you and you didn't even know it, well, you weren't that scared. But if I came to your house with a gun, that's much more serious than coming to your house without a gun. And the more I scared you, and there's no metric here, there's no utils, there's no units of scaredness, but that would be what the courts would have to do. In other words, libertarians can't dictate every jot and tittle to the courts, but the principle. The principle is the more I scared you, the more I should be scared, namely the fewer the chambers and the more bullets. And I claim that under libertarianism, there's not going to be much crime. Because, we're going to have the death penalty for stealing ties or TV sets on occasion. They know that when the soldiers train, if they train with blank bullets and the sergeant says keep your head down, they don't keep their head down. But what they do is they give 1 in 500 bullets a live bullet. And every once in a while somebody gets shot. And they think that, this would only be for a defensive army that I'm favoring, but not an imperialistic one. But, if you favor live ammo, it focuses the mind. So I think we're going to have a lot less crime under a libertarian, very draconian system. But I think it's justified because crime is a violation of the basic principle of libertarianism. Paul?
Well, that's going to be a tough act to follow. I've, long felt the same way that I hear you express about the amazing loss of life and damage from highway deaths, road accidents throughout my life, and that's been exacerbated by losing a number of people from my life personally that way. And I'm really interested to know what kind of response you've had to that book so far. What kind of debate has it engendered? Have you had much response? Where has it gone so far, that debate?
Well, it sold a lot of copies. But by the way, it's available for free on the Mises web, so I'm not flogging it. You can get it for free. All you have to do is download it and print it. So I'm not trying to get you to buy the book. God forbid I should, promote commerce. But it's a very handy book, and if you throw it at people, they'll get hurt because it's about that thick. So buy it. I had this chapter, open letter to the mothers against drunken drivers, and no response. But then again, the response of my book, Defending the Undefendable, in the Times Literary Supplement was, the only good thing about the book was the cartoons. It really hurt me, but coming from them, it's a compliment. So, there's been no movement, Ron Paul has been grilling Bernanke, he hasn't been grilling the head of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and maybe I'll ask Ron to do that. But so far, nothing much has happened. The book has been out a year. There's been no move toward highway privatization. It's a very complicated issue. I mean, the minimum wage is a lot simpler than that. And how have we been doing on the minimum wage?
We got the best in Canada, we see.
I'm sorry?
We got the best in Canada, we see.
Ah, thanks. In spite of Paul's best efforts. So, we libertarians are what, 1, 2, 3% of the population? 4%, depending on how you count. So it shouldn't be a big surprise that we're not winning. I mean, we're lucky we have Ron Paul, who's doing magnificently, and it's up to the rest of us to keep pushing, I guess. Louis?
Yeah, I just, all these different terms, they have different meanings for different people, and, things like freedom and what is a crime, and even socialism, capitalism. So sometimes it's not too clear, but there's a long lineup, so I think I'm just going to stick to one of the things that I'm kind of zeroing in these days, and that's democracy. And I think I know what your opinion is, but I'd like to know what Larry's opinion is of democracy. And anybody in the room here, like, who's in favor of democracy? Anybody in the room?
We'll take a vote.
Let's take a democratic vote on who's in favor of democracy. Larry, do you want to?
Democracy against what? Compare it with something else?
If you go to the fee site, fee.org, and in our search engine type golden calf democracy, you'll get an essay I wrote some years ago that will answer this more fully. The golden calf of democracy was the title of it. It's vastly overrated. And you have to start, to fully understand it, you have to start with a definition of it. A pure democracy would mean a political system in which everybody votes on everything. And there would be no such thing as an individual right that is beyond the power of some majority to vote away. And when you explain it that way, I think most people would say, well, gee, I guess I'm not in favor of that. The problem is that today people use the term very cavalierly in a very broad way to mean, well, a system in which you and I can run for office, we can vote for people we like, we can unelect them, we have some say. And I would say, certainly that's better than a dictatorship. But if there's one real saving grace of democracy, loosely defined, it is this. It allows for change without violence. A system in which you and I have some say has characteristics of the democratic ethos, in which you can run, you can change those in power. At least there's a safety valve for change in society without violence. If you have a dictatorship where one guy's in charge and for life, and society, meantime, starts thinking in other directions than he's thinking, well, then you've got a potential for violence and bloodshed and loss of life. At least with democracy, you can make a change, but there's nothing about it that suggests that the change will be for the better. All of that depends on utterly something different, and that is the ideas of the people. You can vote yourself into slavery. And there's an awful lot about the, quote, democratic way of things, the democratic mentality that is very favorable to voting yourself into slavery. If you start thinking that, well, it's a good thing if we as a majority get to decide things that used to be left to individuals and defined by individual rights, well, then pretty soon you start voting away other people's property. Other people start voting away your property. It's a prescription for violence and bloodshed. So that's basically.
Would you agree that democracy at its very best is supposed to reflect the will of the majority? And even if it at its very best, which it never really is, it's still evil and immoral unless you have consent. And because we don't really have consent, then it's evil and immoral. And there's thousands of examples of how you can, the democratic rule is violating the rights of individuals. And actually Hitler was democratically elected.
Yeah,
That's
sure was.
probably the best.
again, there's nothing about it that says you're gonna end up with the right leaders or the right
Yeah,
policies.
that's what I'm saying, like the whole concept, unless you have voluntary consent, it all boils down to voluntary consent. If you don't have that, it's evil and immoral.
Yeah.
And so we should be promoting liberty and forget about democracy. Democracy is actually an enemy
Yeah.
of ours, unless it's through voluntary means.
Yeah, no,
And
I think you're,
Walter agrees with that. He kind of,
yeah, I do too, I think you're essentially right on that. Yeah.
Well, I agree with that, and I agree with Larry's point about circulating people without killing people necessarily. If you're in the chess club, and they have a vote as to whether, we should meet on Wednesday nights or Tuesday nights, or, who takes white and who takes black in the chess game, well, everyone has agreed to be bound by that. You're in the chess club or the tennis club or whatever, and that's fine. Hans Hobby wrote this wonderful book. What's it called? Democracy, the God That Failed?
The God of democracy.
The God That Failed. Democracy, the God That Failed, something like that. A very, very good book. And he makes an interesting point. He says that Obama or Bush are only in there for 8 years, tops. And therefore, you make hay while the sun shines. You rip off as much as you can in 8 years. You kill the golden goose, because after your 8 years, you can't get any more golden eggs. Whereas if you have a monarch, he treats it more in a long run position, because he can keep it for 30 years and then give it to his kid. And therefore, he wouldn't be quite as brutal or quite as wouldn't have as much intervention into the economy if he had any sense, because he'd realize that if we had socialism, he wouldn't have much productivity for him to rip off. So Hans makes a very important point. With regard to socialism, there are two definitions of it. One is the ownership of the means of production. And right now, the U.S. is mostly fascist because Mussolini and Hitler didn't own stuff, rather they regulated it. I mean, Krupp and BMW and Stuka were private companies. He never nationalized them. He just told them what to do. We need this many tanks, this many planes, and they said, okay, let's do it. That's more the Obama-Bush style. But Obama's moving into socialism with ownership of Government Motors. Sorry, I said General Motors. My mistake. So we have socialist elements, we have capitalist elements, and also fascist elements in the U.S. and in Canada. There's another definition of socialism, and that's from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. And if that's done on a voluntary basis, it's fine, like in the monastery or the kibbutz or the family, the little girl. Morgan has a little baby girl. She eats in accordance, not with her ability to earn income, but in accordance with her need, is determined by his boss, his wife. Determines also things like that. So if it's done on a voluntary basis, it's fine, just as democracy if it's done on a voluntary basis. The problem with the political sphere is nobody agreed to be part of the U.S. club. It's not a club, or the Canadian, well, there is a Canadian club, but it's not exactly what I'm talking about. So if everyone agreed, if we had unanimous agreement to be part of the U.S. club or the Canadian Institute of Canada or whatever, then democracy would be a reasonable way to determine what. I mean, if the restaurant here told us we can have either chicken or fish, and we had a vote, and the chicken won out, well, the heck, people would abide by that. So I think Lewis makes a very good point.
But we'd also have to be able to cancel our membership.
Oh yeah, sure. That goes without saying. If you don't like what the club is doing, you can quit the club because it's a voluntary club. The chess club, they meet on Tuesday night, and Tuesday night is your holy night. Well, you quit the chess club. You join another chess club. Yeah.
I got a question. While it's very easy to agree with you on privatization initiative for highways, do you offer any hints what to do in a situation when you have a de facto oligopoly situation, or
De facto what? I didn't hear you.
Oligopoly. When you have
oligopoly.
Sorry,
That's
second
okay.
language.
That's okay.
And the second question I'm trying to load here is, do you entertain ideas of whether software patents are a valid type of personal property? Because one of the mainstream, I guess, sentiments among software developers now is that there should be no right to patent abstract things, and it's a drag on the industry as a whole.
Let me answer those questions in the reverse order. First, patents and copyrights, I guess. Intellectual property is what you're after. Now, originally, Murray Rothbard had the view that copyrights were legit because they were part of a contract, but patents were not. And I agreed with him at the time. I thought patents were crazy because if we believe in homesteading, and you and I are inventing the bicycle, and we both worked 5 years to make the bicycle, and you get to the patent office 5 minutes before I did, and I invented it independently at around the same time you did, you get 100% of it and I get zilch, I get nothing. That doesn't seem fair because I'm losing the fruits of my labor, and you're getting it just because you got there 5 minutes before. So I was clear on patents, and patents were not compatible with libertarianism. And then, you know, if you have intellectual property, I have property in this pen. I can own it for 50 years, and then I can give it to my kids who can give it to their kids. Namely, there's no statute of limitations on ownership of pens. Well, what's this patent for 17 years or 50 years or 30 years after death or any of that? I mean, if it's property, it should be permanent. That's the way other property is, and if ideas are property, well, then why shouldn't they be permanent? So even the advocates of patents are a little inconsistent. Okay, now let's do copyright. Thanks. Stephan Kinsella wrote this magnificent article where he attacked Murray Rothbard. And by the way, that's one of the reasons I'm very proud to be in part of the libertarian movement as opposed to the Randroid movement. Because if you were to write an article attacking Ayn Rand, that would be it. I mean, you know, you don't have to attack it, just ask her a question other than, well, on page 52 of Atlas, you said this, could you elaborate on it? Those are the kinds of questions you can ask her. If you ask anything else, you know, you get booted out. It's very intellectually stultifying. So here is Stephan Kinsella, who writes this beautiful attack on Murray, and as did Hans Hoppe when he talked about his argument from argument, which was very different than Murray. What's Murray's reaction? Wonderful, I was wrong, you're right, this is great, let's work on this. I'm just very proud to be part of a movement that Murray Rothbard was in on. Well, he had the same attitude, I think, towards Stephan Kinsella. I forget when Stephan wrote it, and Murray died in '95. I don't know if Stephan wrote it before or after that. And in any case, Stephan says the whole idea of intellectual property is nonsense from the shoulders up. It's just, it's crazy. What he says is that if you really can own intellectual property and thus make a contract for it, now I'm going to use Hans Hoppe's argument from argument, you're committing a performative contradiction. You can't speak it. See, what Hans's argument for libertarianism was that if you deny property rights, and the non-aggression axiom, namely you deny libertarianism, what are you denying it with? You're denying it with your vocal cords, with your tongue, your larynx, your lungs, your body, and standing room. Well, that's what libertarianism says. You have a right to do it, but you're denying it, so if you deny it, you should shut up. Namely, you can't articulate an anti-libertarian argument logically consistently because you're doing it with libertarian premises, namely you're using your private property. And if you didn't really have it, what gives you a right to speak? Now, let's apply that to ideas. I just had a sentence. Let's apply that to ideas, 6 or 7 words. Well, the word let's, that was made by Mr. Let's. Apply was first created by Mr. Apply. How dare I use let's apply without paying something to the heirs of let's and apply? You get the idea? That if I really believed in intellectual property, I couldn't speak. Because every time I open my mouth and say a word, I'm stealing someone's property. Because someone owns the word let's and apply and the word the and the word but and the word and every word in English and every word in every language was invented by somebody a long time ago. And if we had the God's eye view and we knew exactly who it was, before we could open our mouth, we'd have to find, we'd have to give them money. So it's just an intellectually incoherent way. Stephan Kinsella also says is what you're doing is making something that is non-scarce into something scarce. Girl A puts her hair up in a ponytail. Girl B sees it. Says, oh, that's nice, I'll keep the hair out of my face or whatever. And girl A comes over to her and unponytails her hair. Well, if she did that, she'd be guilty of assault and battery. But that's what she's really contending. You see, when girl B did the ponytail, she didn't take girl A's ponytail away from her. Another example, the way log cabins were first made, they were made with logs, round logs, and you put cement on them, and they were sort of shaky because the logs couldn't sit on each other without the cement, which was just mud. Somebody invented this thing where you cut a notch in the end of the two logs, and now you hardly need the cement because the logs sit on each other with these notches. Okay, so my neighbor Daniel is doing that, and I see it, and I said, whoa, that's great, I'm going to do that. And Daniel comes over and smacks me with his axe because I'm stealing his property? I mean, if he owned it, he would have the right to come after me with an axe. How dare you make a log cabin in the Daniel Gibbs manner? You're stealing my ideas. Stefan has this other magnificent thing. The railroad is coming through town. Right now, the property sells for $100 an acre. But when the railroad comes through, it'll be $10,000 an acre. So somebody sneaks into my house, and he steals the idea. Oh, he's bad. He's a trespasser. He should go to jail. But then what he does is he tells everybody else in Clem's barbershop. And now everybody knows the railroad is coming through. And now I want to go and buy their land. And I say, hey, sell me your land. And they say, sure, 10,000. I say, 10,000? No, it's got to be 1,000. The only reason you're raising it to 10,000 is because you are basing it on stolen property. You are the recipient of stolen goods. You're no better than if you had received a stolen TV. So Stefan just annihilates this idea entirely. Now the question comes, well, what about pragmatics? What about utilitarian considerations? Will we have any more R&D if the, the pharmacy can't have a patent or a copyright on their property? Will we have any more songs if the Beatles can't prevent other people from making Beatles songs and selling them? And what Stefan says is, he says, even if the pragmatics didn't work out, we still stick with the libertarian principle. But it just so happens, luckily for us, that it's also pragmatic. Because right now, if you want to invent something, you just can't go straight down the pike and invent it. You have to go around all the other patents. And you have to fight with a whole bunch of very intelligent lawyers and engineers and scientists over, well, did you infringe or didn't you? So you're spending an awful lot of time in lawsuits. And an awful lot of people are spending their time in the lawsuits who could have been inventing more stuff. So it's very unclear as to whether we would have more or less. And Stefan says the optimal amount, we don't want, look, do we want to spend 100% of our GDP in research and development? No, we'd all starve. Right? So the optimal amount of research and development is not 100%. The optimal amount, he says, is the amount that ensues when property rights are licit, or according to libertarian theory. When paperback books first came out, everyone thought that that'd be the end of hardcover books. Because the hardcover book is $20, the paperback is $5, a ratio like that. Didn't work out that way. People who really want to read that guy will buy his book now because they want it now. And then 6 months later, the other people who only have a smaller desire for the book will get it. I'm not really into ladies' dresses, honest, but my understanding of the ladies' dress industry is the Parisian gowns sell for oodles of money, and they come out first, and then 6 months later, they're available in Macy's. The same dress. And it hasn't stopped the first-run market, so to speak. So he has all sorts of examples like this. Look, suppose someone were to take my book on road privatization, put their own name on it. Well, no, that would be fraud if they put their own name on it. But if they said, this is Walter Block's book, but I'm now bringing it to you, and start selling it, would I lose money? Would I have less of an incentive to write it? Stefan Kinsella says, no, I'd have more of an incentive because now more people would be selling my books and my, speakers' fees would rise. The same with rock bands. The more people that quote unquote pirate the song, the more the demand is for them to make a live appearance. So it's not clear that we'd have any less. It's an empirical issue. And in empirical issues, they're dirty, there's no principle, it depends on which effect is greater than the other. But what Stefan says is that if it works out that there's less R&D, so what? We want the right amount of R&D, and the right amount of R&D is the amount of R&D that ensues from economic freedom. Okay, now the other one is oligopoly or monopoly or antitrust. I have a whole course on that. And you really learn how to put people to sleep when you give them all the diagrams. But I'll give you the 2-minute version of that. What these people are saying, the antitrust people, they're saying is that if we had perfect competition, Tiger Woods would be playing in 12 tournaments a year because the cost curves will zig and zag in such a way. But the dirty rat, he will make more money if he only plays in 9 tournaments because he'll be able to jack up his prices. And we've got to put him in jail for that, so we've got to trust bust him. The antitrust is either you regulate them or you make them into a, what do you call it, a utility, where you regulate them as a utility, you break them up into 1,000 pieces, be rough on poor Tiger, or you nationalize it. That's what they would say you should do. And the reason is that they're saying that the extra 3 tournaments or the extra 3,000 or 3 million cars that the monopolist car, or the extra 3 million computers that Bill Gates should have been producing, are worth more to us, the buyer, than the costs to him. And therefore, we're having a dead weight loss. He should be producing 25% more stuff, but he's not. And we value it more than it costs him. Well, for the Austrians, you see, for all economists, costs are supposed to be opportunity costs or costs foregone. And you can never tell. Like, what are the costs of you people being here in addition to the money? It's the next best thing you could have been doing. Well, what is that? Is it swimming, bicycling, sleeping? Only you can know. I can't go to you and say, your cost is you could have been biking. How do I know that? And yet the antitrust people are saying that the alternative costs of the extra cars are worth less than the value we place on. How do they know that? Now, you see, mainstream economists, in the first chapter of their book, they say, yes, there's no interpersonal comparisons, utility, you can't do this, costs are opportunity costs. And then when they get to the chapter on antitrust, they forget about it. Let me tell you my antitrust joke. You have to really be in for an antitrust joke. I once told this to a bunch of lawyers and economists who were in antitrust field, and they laughed at the first one. The second one, they were dead silence. Okay, so the first one is, there were 3 prisoners in the Soviet Union, and as prisoners do, they were discussing, why you in jail. And the first guy says, well, I was in jail because I got to work late, and they accused me of cheating the state out of my labor services. Second guy says, I got to work early, and they accused me of brown-nosing. Third guy says, I got to work every day exactly on time, and they accused me of owning a Western wristwatch. And I got a big laugh from that group. Now the second one, deadly silence. So I say, now there are 3 US prisoners in jail for antitrust violations. And the first one says, well, they put me in jail because of profiteering. I earned too much profits. Second guy said, I charged low prices and they accused me of cutthroat competition. And the third guy said, I charge the same prices as everyone else, which is hard to understand given these other guys, but it's just a joke. And they put me in jail for collusion. Deadly silence, because they knew that, I had this friend, Ben Klein, a very famous economist. He was my roommate in college. He used to specialize in money, and he once told me there's no money in money. Namely, you can't earn much as a monetary economist. He wasn't in the pay of the Fed at the time, I guess. and where was the money to be earned in economics? Antitrust. Either defending, being an expert witness, saying, well, no, the rules are this way or whatever. These guys make a lot of money, and they're very bright, and they make a lot of money from antitrust. So the last thing they wanted to hear is that antitrust is as silly as the Soviet situation. So for the Austrians, not the Chicagoans who are supposedly free enterprise, but for the Austrians, antitrust is just nonsense. Well, I shouldn't say it. Mises was a little weak on this, but Murray in his book, Man, Economy, and State, really whipped them into shape. One of my first publications in 1973 was an attack on Mises and Kirzner, both Austrians, for messing this one up, for saying that there could be some sense in antitrust. And Murray's Man, Economy, and State has a whole chapter, about 100 pages, just rip that to shreds.
First, I just wanted to read a quote from Mises on the point of democracy. I read Hans Hoff's book. I agree with the central thesis: democracy is inferior to private property, anarchy, and probably monarchy. But to Lawrence's point, here's what Mises says: democracy is therefore not a revolutionary institution. On the contrary, it is the very means of preventing revolution and civil wars. It provides a method for the peaceful adjustment of government to the will of the majority. So that's the one virtue I see in democracy, is regime change without blood spilled. Other than that, I don't know what value it has. But to my question, I wanted to raise an objection to the Hayekian Austrian account of the business cycle you gave.
Get out.
So
Just kidding.
it's the objection from rational expectations theory. So the idea is, well, if this is going on, that low interest rates are pushing businessmen to make all these bad decisions which are misallocative and in the long term are going to sort of come to bite them, why isn't the market sorting out the businessmen, the smart businessmen who understand business cycles and figure out that they shouldn't be making these long-term investments? Why isn't the market weeding out these stupid businessmen in favor of guys who can anticipate, look at government policy and central bank policy and figure all this out? Why does the business cycle still happen?
Yeah, that's a very good question, very good challenging question. Austrian economics is so much on the public agenda that even Krugman is actually criticizing Austrian business cycle theory. I mean, it's the most amazing thing. When I was a kid, they would ignore it. They would say it's a cult. Austrianism is a cult. And we're not required to answer it. But I think thanks to Ron Paul and others, many others, a little bit, it's sort of like, the elephant and the mouse walked over a rickety bridge and the mouse said, boy, we made that bridge sway. Well, Ron Paul's the elephant. The rest of us are mice on his back. Now, the mainstream, the New York Times, in journals, they're actually criticizing Austrian business cycle theory. It's the most amazing thing. The best replier to all of this is a guy named Bob Murphy. Just brilliant. I mean, he and Krugman and he and, what's that guy, David Frum, who's attacking gold. And, Bob Murphy is a one-man band defending this stuff. He's just excellent. On the rational expectations thing, the problem with it is it's sort of, you see, this is what perfect competition is. This is the perfect competition model where everyone knows everything. Well, in reality, and Austrianism is more of a reality-based thing than, well, we're also theoretical, but the theory is based on reality. In reality, we live in a sea of ignorance. We don't know why the interest rate is going down. Is it going down because all of a sudden time preferences have changed on the part of people? Or is it because of monetary policy? It's very, very difficult to tell. See, Austrianism doesn't believe in predictions. You might well say, well, if you're right, why aren't you rich? And the reason we're not rich is because we don't make predictions. We only talk about directions, not quantity. We know that if the interest rate is lower than it should be, certain things happen, but we don't know by how much lower it is. That's something a specialist in prognostication like Doug Casey or Rick Rule or someone like that, or Morgan does a bit of that. It's a very different kind of a thing than Austrian theory. It's not unrelated, and I think the best financial advisors know Austrian economics, but that doesn't guarantee anything. Otherwise, we'd all be very rich and we could, buy freedom possibly. Who knows? So this is part and parcel of the perfect competition model where everyone knows everything, and the reality is that we live in a sea of ignorance. We don't know why the interest rate's going down. Maybe it's justified, maybe it's not. I got into a little fracas with a guy at George Mason called Richard Wagner, Dick Wagner, who made very much the
He's a public choice guy?
Yeah, public choice. He's sort of an Austrian and very, very good libertarian, very great guy. Friends of his, but friends disagree. And what I said in my rebuttal of him is that not only does the lower interest rate fool people into doing it, which you might say, well, why didn't the market get rid of the people who can be fooled? But it also subsidized them into it. Look, right now, the allocation between peas and carrots is the way it should be. I mean, there's nobody writing, oh no, we have too many peas and too few carrots. I mean, the market takes care of that. But suppose the government subsidized peas, and the question is, how long would it last? I mean, and no one knows how long they're going to do it. Nobody knows how long they're going to lower these interest rates for. If they subsidize peas, and we think they'll do it for 5 years, what we'll do is get into it for 4 years and 11 months and then get out and hope there's another sucker. But if everyone knows everything, well then it's sort of like dividing by zero. It's not infinity, but it's undetermined. We have an undetermined model if everyone knows everything and the government intervenes. It's sort of like hard to get your mind around that. What could it mean? So I think that would be my short answer to why rational expectations model is not really a good criticism of the Austrian business cycle. Why don't you come up to the microphone? Yeah, come on. Lila.
It seems that we have competing economic and political systems making it impossible to know which system works better. Now I know because within any system, democracy or dictatorship, you have groups within that country sabotaging that system. Now I understand New Hampshire wanted it to be a libertarian state, and a lot of libertarians were moving there, but then a lot of socialists moved in. So do you think it's at all practical in the future? And I was at a black graduate school one time, and the black intellectuals wanted a state in the US just for black people, because they felt everybody else interfered with their style and their value system. Now, do you think it's at all possible in the future for a country, or for a state, to have states in the US? One libertarian, one socialist, one just racially exclusive, if that's what people want, it's voluntary, to see what works, or are we just, is it in our DNA to destroy what someone else is working?
Well, it's interesting, this comparative systems, the problem that people often bring against us is, well, has free enterprise has your policy ever been implemented? And we have to say, no, not perfectly. But there are some cases where it's almost a controlled experiment, not quite. East Germany and West Germany, North Korea and South Korea was the same people, the same IQ, the same culture, the same language, the same pretty much everything, except for an accident of war. The North Korea and the South Korea pursued different policies, and East Germany and West Germany pursued different policies. And we had almost a controlled experiment where you could say, well, the only thing different between them is in the East Germany and the North Korea, they had socialism or communism. And in the South Korea and West Germany, they had mixed economy, a little free enterprise, a little welfare statism. And look at voting with the feet. Are people trying to get into East Germany from West Germany through the Berlin Wall? Or is it the other way around? Are people trying to get into North Korea or into South Korea? Well, obviously, they're going our way. By the way, do you know what the pattern of voting with the feet was under apartheid South Africa on the part of black people? Into South Africa. They were moving south from Namibia and those other countries, which indicated that in the eyes of the black people on the border, it was better in apartheid, which, our friends on the left would be appalled, because apartheid is like the worst possible thing that you could ever have. Well, there are worse things than that. So, but the answer of them, the answer that they have is, well, you had the wrong communist rulers. The North Korean communist ruler was weak on the fifth lemma of the fourth proof of Marx, and the East German guy was, a little weak on pure communism or something. There's always an excuse. You can never prove it empirically, is the Austrian take on that. What you need is some sort of principle. Why is it that it was so screwy in the North Korea and in East Germany? Perhaps the best book on that is Mises' Socialism, which goes into just why it is, why it's no accident that every time they've ever tried it anywhere, even Plymouth Rock, when the people came and they had these property in common, it didn't work out too well, and a lot of them starved to death in the middle of a wilderness teeming with turkeys and fruit and stuff like that. So I would say You know, it's interesting with the New Hampshire thing. What is it called? The Free State Project. It's a great idea. I'm sort of in favor of it, but when the lefties got hold of the idea, they moved there, and then there were these seascapes or seasteading, where they get a little island or a little artificial island. Well, they've tried that too. Mises had this wonderful quote. Where is the guy who was quoting Mises? You'll have to help me out here. He said something, this is just my paraphrase, that no one can escape. If the society goes down, we all go down with it. There's no running away to Timbuktu or whatever, because they'll come after you. If your seascape is doing too well, they've got more guns. And they've got right on their side, democracy, whatever, you know. They don't like tax havens. You know, there are certain Caribbean countries that have lower taxes, and this is seen as greedy, or I guess it's greedy to try and keep your own money. So I think it's a very good point, which leads me to the question, well, why are we having so much trouble? Why do we only have 2% or 3% of the vote? And my answer to that is sociobiological. What's sociobiology? Sociobiology is the theory that we are the way we are now because of what it took to survive a million years ago. And we're hardwired for some things and we're not hardwired for other things. For example, how many people here are afraid of snakes? A lot of people are afraid. How many are afraid of bathtubs? Nobody's afraid of bathtubs. And yet bathtubs kill many, many more people than snakes do nowadays. Milton Friedman died of a bathtub.
Hey, you don't bathe in snakes every day.
But people are hardwired for it. Milton Friedman died from a bathtub because he slipped on it, he hit his head, and on the way to the hospital he died. Bathtubs are very dangerous. But we're not hardwired to fear bathtubs because fear of bathtubs a million years ago or a zillion years ago meant nothing about survival values. Whereas if you weren't afraid of snakes then, you didn't leave progeny. And the people here are the progeny of those people who survived, and those people were afraid of snakes. Our forebears were afraid of snakes. That's why we're hardwired for it. And we're also hardwired for benevolence. Your friend who was helping the tenant, we see somebody keel over here, even if it's not part of our group, we'll try to help. You see a kid crying, your natural instinct is to help. Because we're hardwired for that. Because if we weren't, we wouldn't have survived the lions and the tigers and the mammoths and all those guys. But we're not hired for free enterprise. There was this wonderful case in New Orleans in the aftermath of Katrina, the responsibility for which was FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers, not the government or the weather. The weather was the excuse they used in the Soviet Union, and we use it here too now. What happened, somebody, ordinarily to buy a gallon of water, it's 50 cents, 75 cents. So a guy came down from Tennessee with a whole truck full of gallons of water, and he was selling for 25 bucks a gallon. And there was a line, 100 people long, waiting to get their water for 25 bucks. Why? Because they valued the water more than 25 bucks. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been online to get it. And one of them had a cell phone and called the cops. He was online. He called the cops. The cops came and stopped it, and everyone online applauded. Now, come on. You know, they say there's no contradiction in nature. This is a contradiction. On the one hand, they're all online to get the water, the precious water. They value it more than the 25 bucks. On the other hand, they're calling the cops to stop it. Why? Because they're hardwired to think that greed and price gouging is evil. In other words, they're only hardwired for explicit cooperation. Explicit cooperation is, you feed me this week, I'll feed you next week, we'll be buddies. And people do that. But we're not hardwired to appreciate price gouging or making a profit which leads resources to the right places. That we have to learn from Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson or from Rational Economics. That's why we have so much trouble. That's why it's the rock of Sisyphus. We keep pushing it up, it keeps coming down. We keep getting, 50 people, 100 people, 1,000 people. Ron Paul gets 15,000 people. That's why we're having so much trouble, because biology is against us. Does that mean we should give up? I'm having fun doing this. It's the most fun thing. You get to tweet noses. It's really wonderful to promote liberty. So I'm not trying to give a recipe for pessimism or for giving up. I'm just trying to impart some reality. Why is it we have so much trouble? I mean, it seems so obvious to us. At the beginning of my talk, I spoke about barbarism versus civilization. And most people in the ordinary course of business, your neighbors, they're not going to come steal your TV. It's just that when it comes to government or you're price gouging or something, their minds go weird because they're not hardwired for it. Maybe in a million years. Don't count on it, but maybe. Yeah.
You mentioned something about socialists coming to New Hampshire afterwards or whatever.
Yeah.
Was that
Yeah.
them coming because the situation was improving?
Motivations are different. My assumption was they were coming to counterbalance the fact that the Libertarians were starting to win local elections because they were all focused on a certain, I forget which town it is, the southernmost town, Nashua, New Hampshire. I'm really not sure of that. But I would imagine part of it is because things are getting better, and part of it is because you want to cock a snook at the Libertarians. Well, it's 4:30, and I'm supposed to stop at 4:30, so thanks for your attention.